My name is Iris, and I am 28 years old. I am currently standing in a room with my parents for the first time in 15 years, and they have absolutely no idea who I am. The rain in Seattle has a specific sound. It doesn't tap, it drums. It was drumming against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the conference room, blurring the city lights into streaks of gray and gold. I stood with my back to the room, staring out at the gloom. My reflection in the glass showed a woman I had carefully constructed. 28 years old, tailored navy suit, sharp heels, and blonde hair cut into a severe professional bob. Behind me, the heavy oak door creaked open. "Excuse me, you there." The voice made my stomach drop. It was a voice I hadn't heard in 15 years, but it still carried that same nasal, impatient whine. It was my father, Ted. I didn't turn around. Not yet. I watched his reflection in the window. He was older, his hairline retreating in defeat, but he wore a suit that probably cost more than a mid-size sedan. Beside him was Linda, my mother. She was clutching a designer handbag like a shield, scanning the room with a look of disdain. "Hello?" Linda snapped, clicking her tongue. "Are you deaf? We're waiting for Arthur. Get us some coffee while we wait. Black for him, oat milk latte for me." They didn't recognize me. Why would they? The last time they saw me, I was a scrawny, brunette 13-year-old crying in a gas station parking lot. I wasn't Iris the CEO back then. I was just expense number 3. "The coffee machine is in the hallway," I said, keeping my voice flat and even, refusing to turn around. "Excuse me," Ted blustered. I could hear the heavy thud of his briefcase hitting the mahogany table. "Do you know who we are? We're Arthur's only family. We're here to sign the conservatorship papers. Now, be a good little assistant and fetch the coffee, or I'll have you fired before ink hits the paper." Arthur's only family. The audacity made my blood boil hot and fast. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. The sound of the rain against the glass grew louder in my ears, drowning out the hum of the air conditioning. Suddenly, I wasn't in a high-rise tower anymore. I was back there, 15 years ago. The smell of expensive cologne in the boardroom faded, replaced by the stinging scent of gasoline and wet asphalt. It was night. The neon lights of a Texaco sign buzzed overhead. I was shivering, hugging my knees to my chest on the curb. The rain was freezing, soaking through my thin denim jacket. "Iris, get out of the car," my father had said, not with anger, but with the casual tone one uses to discard a wrapper. "But Dad, it's raining," I whispered. "We can't do it anymore, Iris," my mother had said from the passenger seat. She wouldn't even look at me. She was checking her makeup in the visor mirror. "The economy is tanking. We have to downsize. You're just too expensive right now. We need to focus on our survival." "Too expensive?" I asked, my voice cracking. "I won't eat much, I promise." "It's not just food, Iris," Ted shouted, finally losing his cool. "It's school, clothes, space. We're moving to a condo downtown. No kids allowed. Now get out." He reached across and shoved the door open. I stumbled out, my sneakers splashing into a puddle of oil and water. "Wait here," Linda said, finally glancing at me. Her eyes were empty. "Someone will find you. You're a smart girl." Then the engine revved. The taillights of their BMW flared bright red, 2 demon eyes in the darkness, and they peeled out of the lot, leaving me alone in the dark, cold rain. "Hey!" Ted's voice in the present day snapped me back. He slammed his hand on the table. I took a deep breath, smoothing the fabric of my jacket. I watched the rain hit the window one last time. "You have no idea who you're talking to," I thought. The memory held on tight, refusing to let me return to the boardroom just yet. After the taillights faded, Time became a blur of blue flashing lights and the static crackle of a police radio. I remembered the smell of the station, stale coffee, floor wax, and the metallic tang of damp coins. I sat on a hard plastic chair, wrapped in a scratchy gray wool blanket that smelled like dust. I waited for hours. I thought maybe they would come back. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe a test. Then the double doors swung open. It wasn't my parents. It was a man I had only seen in Christmas photos my father used to mock. Crazy Arthur, Dad called him. The guy who works too much and has no life. Uncle Arthur didn't look crazy. He looked terrified. He rushed past the desk sergeant, his trench coat flapping behind him, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He was panting, his face flush red. When he saw me, his shoulders slumped, and he let out a breath that sounded like a sob. "Iris," he whispered. He knelt in front of me, ignoring the dirty linoleum floor. He reached out, then hesitated, as if afraid I might break. "They called me," he said, shaking, his voice trembling. "The police found your number in your backpack. Your parents—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The anger in his eyes was terrifying, but it wasn't directed at me. He took off his coat, it was warm and smelled of cedar and old paper, and wrapped it around my shoulders over the scratchy gray blanket. "You're coming with me, tonight, forever. I don't care what they say." That night, I saw wealth for the first time. Real wealth. Not the flashy, leased car wealth my parents pretended to have. Arthur's house was a fortress of stone and glass on the edge of the Sound, but it was quiet, dead quiet. The hallways echoed with our footsteps. It felt less like a home and more like a museum for a life he hadn't had time to live. He made me hot chocolate in a kitchen that was bigger than my old apartment. He sat across from me at the island, watching me drink it with sad, tired eyes. "Why?" I asked, my voice small. "Why didn't they want me?" Arthur reached across the granite countertop and covered my hand. His hand was rough, calloused from years of actual work before he moved to the boardroom. "Because they are fools, Iris," he said firmly. "They see the cost of things, but they don't know the value. That is a mistake I will never make." A few weeks later, he found me in his study. I was supposed to be doing homework, but I had organized his chaotic pile of shipping manifests instead. I had lined them up by date, region, and weight, calculating the variances in the margins. He picked up a sheet, his eyebrows shooting up. "You found the error in the Tacoma shipment?" "The numbers didn't add up," I shrugged, terrified I was in trouble. "It was off by 4%. Arthur didn't scold me. He smiled, a real, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He pulled up a chair next to me. "You have a gift, Iris," he said softly. "They threw away a diamond because they thought it was glass. I'm going to teach you everything. How to run the business, how to protect yourself, and one day, you're going to be the one holding the pen." The pen. The memory snapped. The sound of a heavy object slamming onto the table brought me back to the present. "The pen!" Ted shouted, his face turning a blotchy purple. "I said, bring me a pen! Are you stupid as well as deaf?" I slowly turned around to face them. I turned slowly, my heels pivoting silently on the plush carpet. I kept my face blank, a porcelain mask of corporate servitude. "I apologize for the delay," I said. My voice was cool, stripped of any distinctive cadence that might trigger a memory in their self-absorbed brains. I walked to the sideboard, poured 2 cups of coffee, black for him, oat milk for her, and placed them on the table. Ted didn't even look up. He was too busy scrolling on his phone, his thumbs swiping aggressively. "About time. Do you have the paperwork ready? The transfer of power? We have a lunch reservation at 1, and I don't want to be late." Linda took a sip of the latte and immediately wrinkled her nose. "Ugh, lukewarm. Whatever, just get us the pen." I pulled a sleek, silver Mont Blanc pen from my breast pocket. It was a gift from Arthur for my 25th birthday, engraved with the initials IV, Iris Vane. I set it down gently on the mahogany table, right between them. "Mr. Sterling will be here shortly," I said, stepping back into the shadows of the room's corner. "He prefers to review the documents personally." "Mr. Sterling is a vegetable," Ted scoffed, picking up the pen and twirling it. "The old man can barely remember what day of the week it is. That's why we're here, to save the company from his incompetence." My stomach tightened. Arthur wasn't incompetent. He was recovering from a mild stroke, yes, but his mind was sharper than Ted's had ever been. But Arthur was tired. He was tired of fighting, and he had trusted me to handle the wolves at the gate. "It's really for the best," Linda added, adjusting the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. She lowered her voice, leaning in toward Ted, though she didn't care if I heard. To them, I was furniture. "Once we sign the conservatorship, we can move him to that facility in Tacoma, what was it called? Shady Acres?" "Greenwood," Ted corrected. "It's half the price of the one he wants. Why waste the inheritance on fancy nurses when he won't know the difference?" "Exactly," she giggled. "And with the money we save on his care, we can finally put a down payment on that Aspen property." I felt a cold rage settle in my chest, heavy and solid like a stone. They weren't just here to steal the company. They were planning to discard Arthur exactly the way they had discarded me. They were going to throw the man who saved their daughter into a bargain bin nursing home so they could go skiing. I clasped my hands behind my back to stop them from shaking. "Is the facility comfortable?" I asked. I couldn't help myself. Ted shot me a glare. "That is none of your concern, sweetheart. You're paid to file papers, not ask questions. Know your place." Know my place. I looked at the man who shared my DNA. I looked at the woman who had birthed me. I saw the greed etched into the lines around their eyes. "You're right," I said softly, a ghost of a smile touching my lips. "I know exactly where my place is." The door handle turned. Uncle Arthur walked in. He was leaning on a cane, looking frail, but his eyes found mine immediately. He gave me a barely perceptible nod. The trap was set. The transformation was instantaneous. It was like watching a switch flip. As soon as Uncle Arthur stepped into the room, the sneering, arrogant monsters who had just insulted me vanished. In their place stood two concerned, loving relatives. "Arthur!" Ted cried out, his voice dripping with synthetic warmth. He practically leaped from his chair, rushing over to wrap his brother in a hug that looked more like a restraint hold. "My God, you look tired, brother." Linda followed close behind, her heels clicking rapidly on the floor. She clasped her hands over her heart, tilting her head. "Oh, Arthur, we've been so worried. When we heard about the episode, we just dropped everything." I stood in the corner, my hands folded behind my back, watching the performance. It was sickening. They hadn't called him in 5 years. They hadn't visited in 10. Arthur endured the hug, his body stiff. He leaned heavily on his cane, playing the part we had rehearsed. He let his hand tremble slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "Ted?" "Linda," Arthur said, his voice raspy. He looked smaller than usual, sinking into the head of the table as Ted pulled out his chair for him. "I didn't expect to see you." "We're family, Artie," Ted said, using a nickname I knew Arthur hated. Ted sat down, pulling his chair uncomfortably close. "Family steps up when things get hard. We know you're struggling to manage all this." He gestured vaguely at the room, at the company, at the empire Arthur had built from scratch. "It's too much for a man in your condition." "My condition?" Arthur repeated, his eyes flickering toward me for a split second. "Yes," Linda chimed in, reaching out to pat Arthur's hand. Her long, manicured nails looked like talons against his papery skin. "We want you to rest, to relax. We've spoken to the lawyers. We're willing, happy, really, to take the burden off your shoulders. We can handle the heavy lifting. You just need to sign a few things so we can get you the care you deserve." There it was, the pitch, the care you deserve, meaning a cheap room and a sedated existence while they burned through his cash. Arthur coughed, a dry, rattling sound. "And the company, my employees?" "Oh, don't worry about them," Ted said quickly, waving a hand dismissively. "We'll make sure everything is streamlined, efficient. We're business people, Arthur. We know what we're doing." I bit the inside of my cheek. They didn't know the first thing about logistics. They thought streamlining meant firing the warehouse staff to boost quarterly profits. "Girl," Ted snapped his fingers without looking at me. "The papers, now." I stepped forward, the folder heavy in my hand. Inside wasn't what they thought, but I wasn't ready to reveal the card just yet. I placed the blue folder on the table in front of Arthur. "Here are the documents you requested, Mr. Sterling," I said. Ted snatched the folder before Arthur could touch it. He flipped it open, scanning the pages hungrily. Yes, standard conservatorship, power of attorney, asset transfer. Looks like the lawyers did their job. He pulled the silver pen, my pen, closer and uncapped it. He thrust it into Arthur's trembling hand. "Just sign here, here, and here," Ted commanded, pointing to the X lines. "Then we can go get some lunch. Linda is starving." Arthur held the pen, hovering over the paper. The room went silent. The only sound was the rain and the heavy breathing of two vultures waiting to pick the bones clean. "You really think this is best?" Arthur asked, looking up at his brother. "You'll take care of everything?" "Trust me," Ted grinned, and the greed in his eyes was naked and ugly. "I'll take care of it all." Arthur looked at me. His eyes weren't trembling anymore. They were steel. "I think," Arthur said, his voice suddenly steady and strong, "I'd like my assistant to read the fine print." Ted laughed, a harsh bark of a sound. "Her? She's just a secretary, Arthur. What does she know about corporate law?" I stepped forward, moving out of the shadows. I walked until I was standing directly behind Arthur's chair, facing my parents. "Actually," I said, dropping the corporate mask and letting my natural voice, the voice they might remember, slip through, "I know quite a lot."
The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like the air has been sucked out of a vacuum. Ted blinked, his arrogant grin faltering for a microsecond. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since he walked in. His brow furrowed. He was trying to place the tone of my voice, the shape of my eyes, but the context was all wrong. In his mind, his daughter was a discarded memory, not the woman standing in a $1,000 suit in a Seattle high-rise. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave. "I said," I enunciated every syllable, "I know quite a lot about corporate law. Specifically, I know that signing a conservatorship under duress or false pretenses is illegal." Linda let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Excuse me? Who do you think you are talking to? Arthur, tell your girl to step back before I call security." Arthur didn't move. He didn't speak. He just sat there, clutching his cane, a small, sad smile playing on his lips. I took another step forward. I placed my hands on the back of Arthur's chair, a protective stance. "You don't need security, Mrs. Vane," I said, using their last name intentionally. "We're already here." Linda froze. Her hand went to her throat. "How do you know my name? I never introduced myself to you." "You didn't have to," I said. "I've known your name for 28 years." I reached up and tucked a strand of blonde hair behind my ear, a nervous habit I had as a child, one I knew they would recognize. I let my face soften, dropping the professional mask completely. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. "Hello, Mom." "Hello, Dad." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Ted's face went slack. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked from me to Arthur, then back to me, his brain trying to bridge the gap between the 13-year-old girl he abandoned and the woman standing before him. "Iris?" Linda whispered. It wasn't a greeting, it was a question terrified of the answer. "Yes," I said. That's impossible," Ted stammered, standing up so abruptly his chair screeched against the floor. She's gone. She's dead, found Mayford, a failure? Is that what you told yourselves so you could sleep at night?" Linda started to tremble. "We did what we had to do. We were broke. We couldn't—" "You bought a boat 3 months later," I cut her off. My voice was ice cold. "I saw the photos. You named it Freedom. I was living in a shelter for 2 days before Arthur found me. You bought a boat." "Arthur found you?" Ted spun on his brother. You knew where she was? You've been hiding her this whole time?" Arthur finally spoke. His voice was strong, booming in the acoustic space of the boardroom. "Hiding? No, I was raising her. I was doing the job you were too selfish to do." Ted's shock began to curdle into anger. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "So this is a setup? A trap? You think you can shame us? We're still his next of kin. We still control this family." I laughed. It was a dark, dry sound. "You control nothing." I reached over Arthur's shoulder and took the blue folder from the table. I flipped it closed and tossed it aside. Then I pulled a second folder, a thick black binder from my briefcase on the floor. "You came here to sign a conservatorship," I said, sliding the black binder toward them. "But we're here to sign something else."
Ted stared at the black binder as if it were a bomb. His hands, usually so steady when holding a martini glass, trembled as he flipped the cover open. "What is this?" he muttered, scanning the legal jargon. "Purchase agreement? Asset liquidation?" He looked up, a flicker of hope returning to his eyes. "You're selling the company? Well, that's not the worst idea, Arthur. Cash out, liquidate. Who's the buyer? Some Chinese conglomerate? A tech firm?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned the page, his eyes darting to the bottom line, the price tag. His eyes widened. 300 million? He whistled low. Okay, I can work with this. If we get power of attorney, we can manage this liquidity event for you, Arthur. We can—" "Read line 4, Ted," Arthur interrupted, his voice dry and amused. The line labeled buyer. Ted squinted. He read it out loud, his voice trailing off into a confused squeak. "Buyer, Iris Vane Holdings, LLC." He froze. The room went silent again, but this time the silence wasn't heavy, it was electric. "I don't understand," Linda said, leaning over his shoulder, her perfume wafting in a cloying cloud. "Who is Iris Vane Holdings?" "I am," I said. I walked around the table, my heels clicking a steady rhythm on the hardwood floor. I stopped right next to Ted. I could smell the sweat breaking out on his neck. "You?" Ted scoffed, slamming the binder shut. "Don't be ridiculous. You're a secretary. You fetch coffee. You don't have $300 million. You don't have $300. "You're right," I said, leaning against the edge of the table, crossing my arms.
I don't have 300 million. I have significantly more. I gestured to the glass walls, to the sprawling port of Seattle visible in the distance, where cranes were loading containers onto ships that belonged to this company. Arthur didn't just give me a room, Dad. He gave me a job, a real one. When I was 16, I started in data entry. By 20, I was managing logistics for the Pacific Rim. By 25, I was the CFO. I looked at Arthur, who was beaming with pride. He paid me, generously. And unlike you, I didn't spend it on boats or condos in Aspen. I invested it. I built a portfolio. And when Arthur decided he wanted to retire, I made him an offer, a fair market offer. I tapped the black binder with my index finger. The wire transfer cleared this morning at 9:01 a.m. The deed to this building, it's in my name. The fleet, my name. The chair you are sitting in, I leaned down, bringing my face inches from his. That's my chair. Get out of it. Ted sat paralyzed. His brain couldn't compute the shift in reality. The abandoned daughter was now the titan he wanted to rob. But Linda was faster. I watched her face change. The shock melted away, replaced by a terrifying, desperate warmth. The same look she used to give waiters before sending back a dish. She stood up and walked toward me, her arms opening wide. "Oh, Iris!" she cried, tears instantly welling up in her eyes, tears that I knew were fake. "My baby girl, a CEO, a tycoon. Ted, look, she's a genius, just like her mother." She reached out to hug me. "We knew you had it in you. That's why we left you, to make you tough, to give you this drive. It was all for you, sweetie." I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just held up a single hand. "Stop," I said.
Linda froze, her arms still outstretched in that grotesque parody of maternal love. My single word, stop, hung in the air like a blade. "Iris, honey," she wavered, her smile twitching at the corners. "Don't be like that. We're a family. We can work together. Think of what we can do with this company. Ted has connections in marketing. I have friends in—" "I don't need your connections," I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "And I certainly don't need your friends." I walked back to my briefcase. The rhythmic click of my heels was the only sound in the room. I reached into the side pocket and pulled out something small and crumpled. I walked back to Ted, who was still frozen in my chair. "Get up," I said. He scrambled out of the chair, nearly tripping over his own feet, backing away until he hit the wall. I sat down. The leather was still warm from him, a sensation that made my skin crawl. But I leaned back, claiming the space. I was the CEO. This was my throne. I placed the object on the table. It was a single, wrinkled $1 bill. "Do you know what this is?" I asked. Ted stared at it, confused. $1? "It's the bus fare, from the gas station to the shelter. I kept it. I found it in the pocket of that denim jacket you hated so much. I kept it to remind myself of what I was worth to you." I slid the dollar across the mahogany surface. It stopped right at the edge of the table, in front of Ted's stomach. "Take it," I said. "Iris, please," Ted begged, his voice cracking. The reality was finally sinking in. The money was gone. The power was gone. "We're broke. The condo is underwater. The car is leased. If we can't—" "Take it," I repeated, harder this time. "We have nowhere to go," Linda shrieked, her facade finally shattering into pure panic. "You can't do this to us. We gave you life." I corrected, "You gave me a trauma. Arthur gave me a life." I pressed a button on the intercom console built into the table. "Security?" I said into the microphone. Please escort Mr. and Mrs. Vane from the building and mark their faces in the system. They are banned from all company properties, warehouses, offices, shipping yards, everything." "Yes, Ms. Vane." The voice crackled back instantly. Two burly security guards in dark uniforms opened the door. They didn't look like mall cops. They looked like they could bench press a small car. They stepped into the room, their faces impassive. "Mr. Vane? Mrs. Vane?" the lead guard said, gesturing to the door. "This way, please." Ted looked at the guards, then at the dollar bell, then at me. His face crumpled. He was a small, sad man in an expensive suit that didn't fit him anymore. He reached out with a trembling hand and took the dollar bill. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. Linda tried to scream something as the guard took her arm, but the door closed before the sound could fully escape. Silence returned to the boardroom. Beautiful, golden silence. I exhaled, a breath I felt like I had been holding for 15 years. My shoulders dropped. "Well," Arthur said from his side of the table. He was smiling, a mischievous twinkle in his eye. "That was cinematic." I looked at him and grinned. "Too much?" "Just enough," he said.
The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing out the noise, the drama, and the past. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The adrenaline that had been fueling me for the last hour began to ebb away, leaving behind a strange, hollow exhaustion. But it was a good kind of tired, the kind you feel after hiking a mountain you weren't sure you could climb. Arthur sighed, a sound that seemed to release 10 years of worry from his lungs. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a set of keys. They were old brass keys, the ones to the private executive elevator and the main vault. He slid them across the table, right over the spot where the purchase agreement lay signed. "I suppose these are yours now," he said softly. I picked them up. The metal was cool against my skin. "Are you sure you're ready to just walk away?" Arthur laughed, leaning back in his chair. "Iris, I've been ready for 5 years. I was just waiting for you to be ready to take it." He adjusted his glasses, looking at me with a warmth that my parents had never possessed. "Besides, I have a plane to catch. Italy. I hear the Amalfi Coast is beautiful this time of year." "Italy?" I smiled, feeling the corners of my eyes prickle with fresh tears, happy ones this time. "And then maybe Japan," he mused. "I want to spend my money, Iris, on pasta, on wine, on sunsets, not on nursing homes, and certainly not on Ted's gambling debts." I stood up and walked over to the glass wall. The rain had finally stopped. The heavy gray clouds were breaking apart, revealing streaks of deep twilight blue and the twinkling grid of the city below. Arthur joined me. We stood side by side, looking out at the empire of logistics and transport that moved the world. "You know," he said quietly, looking at our reflections in the glass, "they were wrong about you that night at the gas station. They said you were a burden, a cost." I nodded, the memory still sharp but no longer painful. It was just a scar now. "They didn't know," Arthur continued, placing a hand on my shoulder, "that you were the greatest investment I ever made." I turned to him and hugged him. It wasn't a stiff corporate hug. I held onto him like the lifeline he was. "Thank you, Uncle Arthur, for everything." "You earned it, kid," he whispered, patting my back. "Now I'm going to go pack. You have a company to run." He walked to the door, his cane tapping a rhythmic goodbye. When the door closed behind him, I was alone in the boardroom. I turned back to the window. Below me, the city was alive with light. Somewhere down there, a black BMW was driving away, carrying 2 people who had lost everything because they couldn't see the value of what they had. I gripped the brass keys in my hand. I wasn't the girl crying in the rain anymore. I wasn't the expense. I wasn't the victim. I was Iris Vane, and I was just getting started.